Somewhere beneath the hills of northern Italy, a man sits alone in the dark, watching you, watching all of us. And for 7 years, no one has been able to find him. Right now, at this exact moment, there are over 4,000 live security cameras across Europe feeding footage into a single underground room. Train stations in Berlin, parking garages in Madrid, side streets in Prague. A man you have never heard of is watching all of it, in real time, from a reinforced concrete bunker buried 40 feet below a mansion that, on paper, belongs to a dead man. No windows, no sunlight, no visitors, just screens, thousands of them, and one pair of eyes that never stop moving. Intelligence agencies across 3 countries have quietly listed him as deceased. Interpol closed their active file on him in 2021, officially citing lack of evidence of continued activity. 2 rival crime families sent assassins to confirm his death and collect proof. Neither assassin came back. The file stayed closed. In the criminal underworld, people don't say his name above a whisper, not because they respect him, but because they're not entirely sure he isn't listening. And given what we now know about his surveillance network, that fear is not paranoia. It is perfectly reasonable. For 7 years, this man did not leave, did not surface, did not make a single move that could be traced back to a living, breathing human being. The people who worked for him communicated through encrypted systems they didn't fully understand, following orders that arrived with no explanation and no signature. Some of his own lieutenants genuinely believed they were being run by a ghost, or worse, by someone who had become something beyond human in that dark underground room. So ask yourself this question and really sit with it. What could make a man like that come back? What could shatter 7 years of silence, 7 years of careful, disciplined invisibility in a single night? What could be powerful enough to make the most feared man in Europe abandon the only thing keeping him alive, his absolute refusal to be seen? The answer isn't money. He has more than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. It isn't power. He never stopped having that either. The answer was a face. Seen for 11 seconds on a grainy subway camera in Prague on a stormy Tuesday night at 2:47 in the morning. A face that should have been dead for 12 years. To understand why that face broke him open, you need to understand who Victor Morelli actually was, before the bunker, before the silence, before the ghost story. Because Victor Morelli was not born dangerous. He was built that way, slowly, deliberately, by a world that kept teaching him the same lesson until he finally learned it well enough to turn it into an empire. He grew up in Calabria, in the deep south of Italy, in a town so small and so poor that ambition itself felt like a kind of arrogance. His father worked the same stretch of land his grandfather had worked. His mother kept a photograph of the sea on the kitchen wall, the closest she ever got to it. Victor watched them both grow old before their time, ground down by a life that offered nothing but more of the same. He left at 17 with 40 euros and a name that meant nothing to anyone. By 32, that name made generals nervous. What Victor built over the following decade wasn't just a criminal network. It was an intelligence operation disguised as one. He understood, earlier than almost anyone in the European underworld, that information was the only currency that never lost its value. While other bosses were moving product and counting bodies, Victor was building relationships with port officials, border agents, municipal planners, and telecommunications engineers. He didn't buy loyalty with fear. He bought it with precision, knowing exactly what each person needed and providing it before they even had to ask. By 40, his network stretched from Palermo to Warsaw. 16 countries, 43 operational cells, and not a single piece of paper anywhere in the world with his name connected to any of it. Interpol knew he existed the way, a headache is coming, that pressure building at the base of the skull, no visible cause, nothing you can point to. They knew the architecture of his operation. They could see the shape of it. They just couldn't find a man at the center. No photograph on file, no financial trail, no verified location. A ghost in an Armani suit running the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in modern European history. And he might have remained exactly that, a whisper a legend, an unsolvable problem, if not for the only weakness Victor Morelli ever allowed himself. His family. Alara came into his life at 34, at a dinner in Venice that Victor attended for business and left from transformed. She was not from his world. She was a linguistics professor from Sarajevo, brilliant and precise, and entirely unimpressed by the kind of power Victor had spent his adult life accumulating. She saw through the architecture of him immediately, and instead of frightening her, it seemed to simply interest her, like a puzzle she'd already decided was worth solving. He married her within a year. It was, by every account from people who knew him then, the only truly reckless thing Victor Morelli ever did. Sophia was born when Victor was 37. She had her mother's patience and her father's eyes, an extraordinarily rare heterochromia, one green and one amber, that Victor privately believed made her look like she was seeing two different versions of the world at once. He gave her a necklace for her 5th birthday, a small crescent moon pendant, handmade by a jeweler in Florence, one of a kind. He fastened it around her tiny neck himself, and she wore it every day after that without ever being asked to. Those were the years Victor would later describe, to no one because there was no one to tell, as the only ones that felt real. Then came the war. The details of what the underworld calls the Morelli collapse are still disputed, still half-buried in rumor and deliberate misdirection. What is known is this. In the spring of 2013, 3 rival factions coordinated a simultaneous move against Victor's network, a level of cooperation between historically hostile criminal organizations that should have been impossible. The attempt on Victor's life came first. A car bomb that killed his driver and his bodyguard and left Victor with a shrapnel scar running from his left jaw to his collarbone and a hearing loss in his right ear that never fully recovered. He survived. Alara and Sophia did not, or so he was told. The massacre at the estate outside Verona happened 3 nights later. By the time Victor's men reached it, there was nothing left to confirm or deny. No bodies recovered. No evidence of what actually happened in those final hours. They told Victor his family was dead. Victor never believed it. Not completely. Not in the part of himself that stayed awake at 3 a.m. running the same terrible calculations over and over. No bodies. No proof. Just absence, which is not the same thing as death, and Victor Morelli knew the difference better than most. He retreated underground 6 weeks after the massacre. Took everything, his network, his systems, his obsession, and buried it all beneath a mansion in the northern Italian hills registered to a holding company that didn't exist. He built the surveillance room over 3 months. For 1,000 cameras, eventually, every major transit hub, public square, border crossing, and city center in Western and Central Europe fed into his screens. He told himself it was operational. A command center. The only way to run a network without being visible. But every person who has ever lost someone they cannot confirm is gone knows what Victor was really doing. He was looking for them. And every single night, before he began his surveillance shift, Victor Morelli sat in the dark and played the same 30-second video clip on the screen in the corner. Sophia, at her 6th birthday party, laughing at something just off camera, a laugh so sudden and so complete that her whole body was involved in it, head thrown back, necklace catching the light. 30 seconds. Every night. For 7 years. It was the last image he had of her. It was the reason he kept watching. And on a stormy Tuesday night in March, at 2:47 in the morning, Camera 7 at a Prague subway station gave him a reason to believe he hadn't been watching for nothing. The night it happened, Victor wasn't looking for anything. That's the part that matters. After 7 years of searching, 7 years of scanning 4,000 cameras with the focused desperation of a man who refuses to accept the only logical conclusion, Victor had finally settled into something closer to routine. The searching had become mechanical, automatic, the way breathing becomes automatic. You don't think about it. You just do it, because stopping means something you're not ready to face. It was 2:47 in the morning. A storm was moving across Central Europe. He could see it playing out across a dozen feeds simultaneously, rain sheeting sideways through the streets of Dresden, lightning freezing the Vltava River in white for half a second at a time. His coffee was still hot. He was on his fourth cycle through the Eastern European transit feeds, eyes moving across the grid with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this so many times that his brain had learned to flag anomalies before his conscious mind caught up. Prague. Hlavní nádraží station. Kamera 7. Platform level. She moved fast through the late crowd, hood up, shoulders down, the deliberate body language of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, to take up as little space as possible in public. Mid-20s. Average height. Nothing about her silhouette that should have snagged his attention at all. Victor's hand was already moving to advance to the next feed. Then she looked up, just for a moment. A reflex, checking the departures board above the platform. 2 seconds, maybe 3, where her face caught the fluorescent light at exactly the right angle and Victor's hand stopped moving. He has never been able to explain, to himself or anyone else, how he knew in that precise instant. Before the software, before the analysis, before any rational confirmation whatsoever. He just knew, the way you know your own heartbeat, the way your body recognizes something your mind hasn't finished processing yet. Her eyes, one green, one amber. In 7 years of watching Europe through 4,000 lenses, Victor Morelli had never seen that combination on another human face. He had looked, not consciously, not as a defined search parameter, but some part of him had been cataloging eyes for 7 years, and in 7 years, those 2 colors in that combination had never appeared on his screens. Until camera 7, platform level, 2:47 a.m. And then, as if the universe had decided one impossibility wasn't enough for a single Tuesday night, the woman shifted her bag strap, and the movement pulled her collar aside. At her throat, catching the light the same way it had caught the light at a birthday party 30 seconds of footage ago, and 7 years of grief ago, was a small crescent moon pendant. Handmade. Florence. One of a kind. Victor stopped breathing. He doesn't know how long he sat there before he moved. The coffee went cold. He knows that because he reached for it eventually, and the cold was a shock, which means significant time had passed, and he has no memory of it passing. His entire nervous system had rerouted itself to a single task. He rewound the footage. Watched it again, rewound it, watched it again. He did this 23 times. He counted later in the log. Each pass isolating a different detail, burning it into his memory with the intensity of a man who was terrified that if he looked away, it would dissolve into something explainable. Then he pulled up the software. The facial reconstruction program had been built for him by a technician in Bucharest who now lived very comfortably in Portugal and asked no questions. Victor had used it exactly once before. 3 years ago, a false alarm in Lisbon that had cost him a week of sleep and 2 weeks of brutal clarity afterward. He knew what it felt like when the result came back wrong. The progress bar moved across the screen. The algorithm mapped the geometry of the face from camera 7 against the age progression model Victor had commissioned and never been able to delete. The result appeared. 87% match. Sophia Morelli. Projected age, 24. Victor sat in the silence of his underground room for a long time after that. He is not a man who talks to himself. Never has been. But in the account he would later give to the only person he trusted even fractionally, he said that in that silence, 3 questions came in sequence, one after another, like rooms he had to walk through. First, am I losing my mind? 7 years of grief does things to a person. He knew that. He had watched it happen to himself with the detached, clinical awareness of someone who couldn't afford to admit it. Was this the crack finally splitting open? Was he manufacturing confirmation of something he had never stopped needing to believe? Second, is this a trap? He had survived 40 years in the most unforgiving ecosystem on Earth by treating every gift as a weapon pointed at him. Someone who knew what he was looking for could construct this. The eyes were unusual, but not impossible to replicate with contacts. The necklace that gave him more pause. Very few people alive knew the necklace existed, but few is not zero. And third, the question that walked through both of the others and rendered them temporarily irrelevant. Where she's alive. Victor Morelli stood up from his chair. For the first time in 7 years, the screens behind him kept running without him watching them. He was done watching. What Victor did in the next 4 hours was methodical in the way that only a truly frightened person can be methodical. Every action precise, deliberate, stripped of any wasted movement, because if he stopped moving, he might stop entirely. First, the network. He activated what his system called the Dead Man Protocols, a cascade of automated commands that would keep his operation running invisibly for up to 90 days without a single human decision required. Orders would route. Payments would clear. The whole vast, silent machine would keep turning on its own, like a clock someone had forgotten was still wound. Then he destroyed his location data. Every log, every access record, every digital trace that could triangulate where the feeds were being monitored from, gone. Not deleted in the way that forensic recovery makes meaningless, but genuinely, physically destroyed. Hard drives pulled and burned. The bunker would look abandoned to anyone who found it, which would tell them exactly nothing useful. Finally, he made one call. A single number, memorized, never written down, that he had not dialed in 4 years. It rang twice before Dante picked up. Dante Ricci had served Victor for 19 years. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent those years carrying heavy things, and possessed of a loyalty so deep and so uncomplicated that Victor had sometimes found it unsettling, as though Dante had made the calculation once a long time ago and had never felt any need to revisit it. He had not seen Victor's face since their last in-person meeting in 2021. He had not asked why. "I need a car," Victor said. "Non registered. Northern Transit Point. 6 hours." A pause on the line that lasted exactly long enough for Dante to understand that something fundamental had shifted. "I'll be there in 5, Dante said. Victor arrived first. He stood at the transit point, a nondescript rest stop off a secondary road, the kind of place designed specifically to be forgotten, and watched the headlights approach through the tree line. When Dante stepped out of the car and crossed to where Victor stood under a single working light, the old soldier stopped walking. Just for a moment. Just long enough to take in what the years had done, and what the last few hours had done on top of that. "You look like a man who just saw a ghost," Dante said. Victor looked at him steadily. "I did." Dante absorbed this. Nodded once. Asked nothing further, because 19 years had taught him exactly when questions were useful and when they were not. Victor laid out the rules as they walked to the car. No phones, not Dante's, not anyone's they came into contact with. No known associates, no family members of known associates, no locations that could be connected to either of their names by anyone with access to a database. No trails of any kind, digital or physical. They would move the way Victor had always moved best, as though they didn't exist. Dante opened the passenger door without a word. Victor paused before getting in. He stood in the open air, properly open, not the filtered, recycled atmosphere of the bunker, but actual night air, cold and wet, and carrying the smell of rain-soaked pine from the hills above. And for a moment that he would never describe to anyone, Victor Morelli simply stood still and let it hit him. 7 years of controlled, underground existence had made the sky feel wrong. Too big, too exposed. Every instinct he had spent 4 decades honing was screaming at him that open space was a threat vector, that visibility was vulnerability, that standing still in the dark meant someone somewhere had a sight line he hadn't accounted for. He stood there anyway. 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then he got in the car. Dante pulled out of the rest stop and onto the road heading north, and Victor's eyes were already moving, scanning the mirrors, reading the dark between the tree lines, cataloging the shape of every set of headlights behind them. The vulnerability was gone. What remained was a predator, one who had not moved in 7 years, and was therefore hungrier than anyone who might be waiting for him could possibly account for. The first rule of investigating someone who may not want to be found is to approach the edges before you approach the center. Victor knew this better than anyone. You don't reach for the person. You reach for the shadow they cast, the documents, the transactions, the small bureaucratic fingerprints that a living human being cannot exist in modern Europe without leaving behind. He started in Prague, not at the subway station. That would be too visible, too traceable, but at the administrative layer underneath it. Through a contact in the Czech civil registry who owed Victor a debt old enough to have gathered interest, he pulled the identity attached to the transit card used at Hlavní Nádraží on the night of the sighting. The card belonged to a woman named Teresa Blahova, Czech national, born 1999, Brno. On paper, completely unremarkable. But Victor had spent 40 years reading documents, and documents, like people, lie in specific ways, depending on who taught them to lie. Street-level forgeries have a particular texture, the wrong ink weight, margins that don't quite align, database entries that exist but have no connective tissue around them, no school records that reference each other, no medical history with continuity. The gaps are always there if you know what absence looks like. Teresa Blahova's documents weren't like that. They were too good. The kind of good that requires either a corrupt government official at a very senior level or an organization with the infrastructure to manufacture identity from the inside out. Every record cross-referenced correctly. Every entry populated with the right supporting documentation. Someone with serious institutional reach had built this woman's Czech identity from the ground up. That was the first thing that told Victor this was larger than he'd allowed himself to consider. The second thing hit harder. When he pulled the surveillance archive from Hlavní Nádraží for the night of the sighting, using a remote access protocol he had built into Prague's transit authority system 4 years ago for exactly this kind of retrieval, he found a gap. Camera 7. Platform level. A 17-minute window centered on the exact timestamp Victor had flagged, partially wiped. Not corrupted, not a technical failure. Deliberately erased with the kind of clean, surgical precision that left a specific signature Victor recognized immediately as professional grade. Someone else had been watching Camera 7 that night, and when they realized what had been captured, they moved to erase it. They were 11 minutes too late. Victor had already pulled his copy, but the implication sat in his chest like cold water. Whoever tried to wipe that footage knew that feed was worth watching, which meant they knew what, or who, was going to appear on it. Victor moved to Vienna within 48 hours. The name Mara Voss surfaced through a document trail that led from the Czech transit card to a Vienna residency registration filed 14 months earlier. She worked at a small translation firm in the 7th District, the kind of business that processed contract documents for mid-level corporate clients, unremarkable enough to disappear into the background of a city built on institutional anonymity. Victor watched her for 3 days from a rotating series of positions, never the same location twice, never within a distance that a trained eye would flag as surveillance. He had done this long enough to be invisible at it. What he saw in those 3 days bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately name. It took until the second day to identify why. Mara Voss lived like someone who had been taught to live carefully. She never took the same route to work twice. She sat with her back to walls and cafes. She paused at corners before turning them. Not obviously, not in a way that would register to a casual observer, but Victor was not a casual observer. These were not the habits of a paranoid person. Paranoid people are erratic. This was disciplined, trained. Someone had taught this woman how to move through the world as though she was always being watched. On the morning of the third day, through a long-lens camera position from a rented room 200 meters north of her office entrance, Victor finally got the confirmation he had been simultaneously chasing and dreading. Mara Voss stepped out of her building at 8:14 a.m., and the morning light caught her collar at the precise angle that made the small crescent moon pendant unmistakable. Victor had the image enhanced and printed within the hour. He sat with it in his hands for a long time. The jeweler in Florence had made one. Victor had watched him make it. There was no other. He had his confirmation. And then, on the afternoon of the third day, Mara Voss walked out of pharmacy on Mariahilferstrasse, paused on the pavement, and turned her head, not scanning the street the way a nervous person scans, but with the specific calibrated movement of someone who has been given a precise location, and looked directly into the lens of a camera Victor had placed in a window alcove 60 meters away. A camera that was the size of shirt button and painted to match the stone it sat against. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she pulled her collar up and walked away faster. Victor was already moving before she turned the corner. His mind was processing the implications in rapid, cold sequence. She hadn't found the camera by accident. She hadn't felt watched in some vague, instinctive way. She had been given coordinates. Someone in real time had her position, had Victor's position, and had chosen that moment to warn her. Someone was running her, and that someone had eyes on Victor right now. He was in Budapest by nightfall. In Budapest, Victor had a contact inside the financial intelligence unit of a private bank that processed shell company transactions across Central Europe. A man named Feher, cautious and expensive and worth every cent. Within 18 hours, Feher had traced the shell company funding Mara Voss's Vienna life through 4 layers of corporate structure across 3 jurisdictions. What he found at the bottom of that structure stopped Victor completely. The shell company's foundational layer had been established 11 years ago. Sophia would have been 13 years old. Mara's apartment, her employment placement, her professional credentials, the language courses that explained her fluency in 4 languages, all of it had been funded and constructed before she was old enough to have needed any of it. Someone had begun building her civilian life while she was still a child, while she was still being shaped into whoever they needed her to become. This was not a witness protection arrangement. This was architecture. Victor located the dead drop site used by the shell company's Budapest handler through a method he would not explain even to Dante. A combination of financial pattern analysis and the kind of instinct that only comes from spending your entire adult life thinking like the people you're hunting. The drop was a hollow bolt in the underside of a park bench near Verislegit. He retrieved the contents at 11 p.m., with Dante watching both ends of the path. Inside the drop was a single item, a photograph, Victor's face. Taken from an angle he recognized immediately, it was the camera position inside his own surveillance room, pointing back at the operator's chair. The timestamp in the corner was from 8 days ago. He stood under the park's lamplight holding a photograph of himself, taken inside a room that no one was supposed to know existed, from a position that would have required physical access to a location that was buried 40 feet underground in the hills of northern Italy. 7 years. Victor had spent 7 years believing he was the one doing the watching. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in clean, typed text, were 4 words. "We never lost you."